Hello?
Morning.
Morning. All right. So I guess we can get started. So this week we had a lot of stuff going on in the lab. We had DevoWorm on Monday, which was very mathematically heavy, as I was informed. But it was basically some readings on, I think there was one reading on optimal transport, and another paper we went over. And so this was like kind of, optimal transport and other kinds of biophysics, but in the context of how to bring that to modeling development. So that's DevoWorm. And then we had our Cybernetics meeting. We returned to our Cybernetics meetings. So we had our Cybernetics meeting, which was kind of an organizational meeting, clearinghouse of ideas. We kind of worked out sort of where we've been in that group, and we've hit a lot of topics, so we needed a chance to sort of figure out how those fit together. And I don't think we got 100% of the way there, but having that outline is good, valuable. We can then go back and I don't know how we want to work out some of those ideas. Hopefully we can work out some of those ideas into artifacts, papers, and presentations and whatever. And then I sort of previewed the paper that we have for the special issue. So that paper is now in the Cybernetics channel, I think, and that's available for people to read and go over. And I'm going to try to go over it somewhat in the Cybernetics meetings. I think we'll have one in 2 weeks, and we'll go over the paper. I don't know if we want to go over it like we usually go over papers, or how we want to do that, but that would be good. There's a lot in there. It's kind of like synthesizing what we've been talking about in the meetings, but also adding some computational toy model type exercises, and considering the role of how the good regulator fits into the machine learning literature and the world models literature. And as it turns out, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with physics modeling, or not physics modeling and modeling physical phenomena, but using things like diffusion and entropy models and things like that. So, we kind of get into a little bit of that, a little bit of, different types of distributions, and then talking about out of distribution things. It's kind of hard to put a succinct description of it here, but going through the paper, it becomes pretty clear how those connections work. So that's Cybernetics. And then of course we had our open source meeting yesterday, which was very good. Sarrah presented on her work, and she's making good progress on the large language models and all that. And then we also had some other updates, and there's a lot of interesting work going on with the open source sustainability stuff. And we also had Jesse talk a little bit about some of his writing exercises for the summer and that sort of thing. And then we had some other updates as well. So it was good stuff. So our meetings are, we're having some good conversations there, some good work being done there.
Yeah, it's been nice to kind of get back a little bit more in the swing of things. I think I saw that the video was posted as well from the Cybernetics reading group.
Yeah.
Titled Cognition Futures instead of Cybernetics reading group.
Oh.
Not a big deal. But it's been interesting to see all the different things coming up, and particularly for the Cybernetics reading group. It's kind of an interesting moment to return to that. I do really look forward to going through the paper. I saw that you posted that in the Cybernetics channel, like the latest update.
Yeah.
Which is good. I have no idea how much is different from the previous one that I was looking at before, but I'll be looking at that.
Yeah.
over this week. I don't think we're having. I probably won't. I'm hesitant to make a Cognition Futures meeting this week because of the way it falls around the holiday stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're going to have any of those meetings this week. I think you will have a. I think DevaWorm and open source meetings will still happen though, right?
DevaWorm, yes, maybe open source, probably open source. I think we need to keep on top of that on a weekly basis. But this in the U.S. it's the 4th of July holiday, so Canada they have July 1st. So actually, Monday we might have a smaller DevaWorm meeting because we have Canadian contingent won't be there probably, so it'll be a little bit different. But anyways, yeah.
Okay.
Right. So that's great. Did you? So let's do updates. And I guess Jesse.
Yeah. If anybody else wants to go first, I might say more in just a few minutes. So I'll pause myself for a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I can go. It's quite short.
Yeah.
I mostly gave most of the updates yesterday. So yeah, as Patty said, like I've been working on the open source model, and I'm like, I would say reaching like some sense of like a good framework model that should be completed hopefully.
Hello.
Add more metrics and build upon. Hi. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. Did it cut off?
Yeah, it did cut off. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just recap. So as I was saying, like as Bradley said, I gave most of the updates yesterday in the open source meetings. I've just been working on the model, and I think I've reached like a good place where I've kind of have a base framework model kind of forming that should hopefully be done by next week, and then I can build up on it, like add more metrics and add subtasks and build up on it. And after yesterday's meet, I had a small meet with Shubham as well. We wanted to kind of, since we're both working on the same project, we wanted to kind of exchange approaches. So even that was nice. And yeah, that's about it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a great bit of work you showed yesterday at our open source meeting. So going through sort of building agents and doing these tasks that are basically open source contributions, and so that's great. I'm really interested to see how that can work out, and I think Shubham is kind of doing a similar thing. And well, I mean, I guess that's kind of the core of the whole sustainability thing, is to build like a model around something like maybe like a pull request, because it's the most sort of quantitative thing you can do in that space. I mean, you can also do things like look at conversations, and we talked about some papers with respect to conversations. So if you had like an open source community, a forum, or a discussion board where you had some thing that you wanted to discuss and people were discussing things, you could use like the large language models for that as well, and kind of get somewhere on like things that aren't like very specific issues but larger conversations. That might be a little harder to do, in fact. So I'm glad that you're doing the open or the GitHub issues. It's a very tractable problem, but there are other ways we can model open source activity. And one of the problems with measuring, and we've talked about this in years past, with measuring open source activity, is that it's hard to you can look at what people are doing on GitHub. You can kind of look at how people are discussing things in your forums, like our Slack, for example. But putting that all together and saying how much people are contributing to a project or how much work is involved in a certain feature or project over a certain period of time is kind of hard to do, to get those statistics or to model those processes. it's hard to do. But this is like I think a good tractable step towards that. So yeah.
Yes, definitely. I do hope like once all of the GitHub part is sorted out, like going to the conversations part is hopefully the next step in the model.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. I don't know if Morgan is available right now, but I know he might not be.
Still gathering myself.
Okay.
Just a bit.
That's fine.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I might go a little bit through. I don't know. Like I might retrace a few things in the Cybernetics reading group, and talk about some other things. But I don't know if you're gonna go. I don't think you're gonna go over more of that stuff later. I don't think your plan is to revisit that yourself.
Not today, no.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm kind of just sharing it just to mention it here. I'm not going to be adding like new things to it. But I'll just I'm just going to share it from the meeting.
Yeah.
It's been interesting to even just retrace a lot of these concepts. I think, and especially things like I'm doing it also. I'm mentioning this also because I'm sort of thinking about in not necessarily in terms of like JoPro working group stuff, but like I continue to try to think of a coherent way to sort of explain or demarcate some of the interests of either like the cybernetics reading group or how it fits with these things we don't really use this phrase anymore, but it's still like the phrase that was imprinted upon me, and so I think about it in the lab as like the representational brains and phenotypes, that big old school banner of ideas and things. And this isn't necessarily that, but we've we've used things like reimagining cybernetics, which is kind of, I think, more fit here, and even getting more deeper into the weeds, like we've talked about, kind of thought about these different foci of research or research thrusts, as a lot of websites, research institutions say. Memory and early biological cybernetics, philosophy of computation was kind of hashed out last time as what to call it. And there's like the history of cybernetics or regulatory theories, as other things that we're looking at here. It's not even a sense of we are trying to do, like we're not, it's sort of even this work of creating internal language to differentiate where we've been, because we've had Michael 11 readings. We've had this is Maturana. This is and that's kind of this whole there's sort of this chain of Maturana and Varela and then post Varela stuff that we've been through, which has extended across the cybernetics reading group and cognition futures and things directly in other parts of the lab, I suppose. This is the Yogi paper, I believe. It's sort of and then the anticipatory systems. So it's I'm particular. I think there's something to be said about thinking about memory, computation, and these regulatory theories. Like in my mind, there's stuff there's something that's at a very early stages of like pre-crystallization, but sort of I'm excited to do that, and especially I'm particularly excited about sort of like I probably should look at this reference for the Wolfram. Who was Wolfram talking to for that? I forget.
Hoffman.
Forget who.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the idea of philosophy of computation in general is interesting because even when I was applying to, I think I applied to like somewhere in the brains, minds, and machines thing at MIT at one point. I don't remember if it was a summer school, which I did go to one time, or one of their programs or something. That was sort of the first time I saw talking about computation in a certain way, and that was some years ago. So now I feel like I have so many more of my own ideas and intuitions and things to sort out about, I guess, what might be philosophy of computation, that I'm excited to go there, particularly in terms of, I think I've even mentioned it during this past meeting, but there was a really, I need to find sort of the original reference point, but there was something in one of my earlier courses for my degree program that was talking about basically data as a byproduct of interacting with computational mediums. And it was worded slightly differently than that. But there's something between that philosophy of computation in general and there's this new space that I don't really know what to call it yet. And things that come to my mind are sort of like decision making or strategy, not quite leadership, but like the nature of not just like, I don't know, economics, like Daniel Kahneman kind of stuff, but much more. I don't know. I really don't know the space for it, but it's sort of keeping in mind philosophy of computation, keeping in mind this sort of interesting, data and computational mediums and the interaction of them, but then also the stuff from this data ethics course that I really enjoyed this recently. This nature of selection of either a model or selection of almost like computational regimes, and saying, okay, this is the signing off on this is the model we're going to use for whatever, and the nature of doing that by whatever the authority is to do so, and so it was an interesting space, and I don't know what to do with it or to say about it. I have to find much more. I'm trying to talk to people who've been like the instructor about it, to say like, hey, like what should I call this as I'm looking into this space, because I don't really know yet, and everybody's kind of on break right now, so it's hard to do that. But I'm mentioning all this out of a sense of there's something there that sort of takes from cybernetics, takes from some of the data science and machine learning stuff that we talked about, but also dovetails a lot into the sort of society ethics tech stuff. Like, I'm sure if I could just talk to a bunch of We Robot people, a conference that we've been at a few times, and ask them about this, they give me really good ideas. They're mostly a bunch of lawyers, in the derogatory term, but there are a lot of policy and legal scholars and lawyer people. Actually, I should ask someone of the legal scholars that I met in Oxford about this. That'd be a fun topic to talk about that with. So great. I just saw. I felt, you know, sometimes you're like, there's something that I have to resolve. I need to just talk about it, and hopefully it will come up. So that was a bit of that. But quite seriously, I think in and of itself, for the reading group, the Cybernetics reading group, reimagining cybernetics, whatever we want to call this space, I'm happy that we're looking at these sort of memory components and sort of their implicit relationship to what we talked about last time, architectures, I suppose, and you know, the kind of variation or not therein, and so on and so forth. Philosophy of computation, and then yes, like these broader take on regulatory theories, ideas, systems. I think that's going to be a very. I'm really looking forward to getting back into that space, and I'm curious personally how it relates to this other data decision making strategy space, or I don't know what to call it yet. If anybody has any ideas about what to call I'm looking for, let me know. But that's sort of a first pass on that. Beyond this, I'm just trying to do a lot of writing. I'm trying to let myself go into a period of writing, and it's actually quite challenging to do the way that I want to do it. So I will be cautious. Like there's something that I could talk more about the thing that I wrote today, but I'm not going to dive into it yet today.
Yeah.
I might talk about it, but I'm not prepared to like show it off and go deeply into it because I haven't had the time to, you know, it's still a draft. It's not a published post.
Right.
But I am, you know, I'm really excited to do that and to do the requisite work. I feel like there's both this, to speak just about the writing process itself here. It's both really rewarding, but also I said to one of my friends this morning, like it's a little bit of the feeling like you're in, let's say undergraduate school, and it's not like finals pressure, but it's sort of like the midterm feeling of, oh man, I have all these like term papers, these like midterm papers. There's like I'm in like 5 or 6 courses, and they all have papers due, and it's sort of that unpleasant motivation, but it's there, and it's just this sense of, you know, doing it is really weird, especially when you're trying to do the kind of writing that I'm interested in doing, which is not. I don't know. I don't have a lot of great examples that fit. Maybe I'm just very ignorant about it. I don't think I'm that special or anything in what I'm trying to say or do. More like I'm just not versed in the art of this kind of writing. So it's challenging in that way. But I'm I'm very happy to start both like publishing some of the things and then thinking about like some of the vantage point stuff. I would like I was looking at a little bit of journals to basically turn it into a paper to do, and I think that could be something. I think there's enough there. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit at some point, and then yeah, I think that's all I need to say about that. No cognition features next week because it's going to be. I don't want to have to like say we're going to do it and then cancel it and then be weird. So I'm just going to do a pause, and next time will be much more clear Wednesday night, as it were. So a lot of Joe Pro stuff is going on. Jen isn't at these meetings, but Jen is doing a lot of really a lot of things. One thing I can kind of say about that, I suppose, is I don't know if anybody's seen the Inside Out movies or Inside Out 1 or Inside Out 2, but what's interesting is that they're sort of based off of certain theories of emotions and certain theories of like internal family systems is one of the major things, but also Paul Ekman of Ekman's Emotions was a consultant, I think, at least on the second one, if not the first one. And it was interesting to see some of the reviews about it and the discussion about it in the sense of, like, I think one person was like, "Well, I want to have 87 emotions in this film. Can we do that?" And then Disney's like, Pixar's like, "No, you got to pick 5. Let's go from there." You know, this sort of, it'd be interesting to find more commentary on how the people in that space chose which emotions to do. And why and how. Like that's something that I think Jen's looking into a bit, and looking at how sort of how's the theory being played out in accessible terms in these movies as part of sort of the mental health working group, like what the broader umbrella of the DSM project and all that stuff. So that's I respect what she's doing there, and we're having a lot of conversations about that and these sort of accessible models of these things. So good for her for that, and I'm looking forward to having a little more of a outside everything I'm saying. Like I have a lot of drive and pressure to update like the Joe Pro website. I'm working on that very much to just have like what to I can like show Notion pages with writing that is sort of generically intelligible to people right now, but I know having some very simple like visualization of what's happening across different groups will matter. So I'm working on that too, which is sort of this dual challenge of writing material, writing conceptual like big vision papers, or writing even just generic statements about blurbs about what's happening, making the website, and writing these actual artifacts. That all the stuff is going on, so I feel like I'm always saying, "Oh, yeah, stuff's going on, stuff good," but that's just the way it is. But there's a lot of fun things happening in that space. I'm looking forward to sharing it more openly ahead. But I'll leave it. Those are my broad updates for now.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and I'm not always in the loop on the sort of the mental health stuff. So I'm glad that you're able to translate that for us here. Yeah, it sounds interesting with emotion in terms of emotions and which ones are most accessible. And there's this aspect of like effective computing and effective modeling where you're trying to model emotional states, either recognizing them or producing them in some way.
We can, I don't know if people want to do that right now, but like some of the things that are coming up in those discussions, I was actually thinking this morning about one thing, like the idea of having a core memory, which is central to both films, is actually a great, like, I think about it, as I think everybody here knows, but just to reiterate, like, I went through across all of these different arenas that we talk about in a lab. I'm always, one of my favorite lenses or favorite, and also sometimes the lens I wish I could put down, but I can't, is the lens of like pedagogy and teaching and instruction and the act of transmitting or like communicating a viewpoint, the vantage point stuff that I'm talking about, but also just like how do you do it, or like how is the creation of alternatives for someone who does not yet have alternatives or nuance happen. And so in the case of Inside Out and core memories, it gives this great visualization. Like it's a great, I have to give them credit. Like it's this wonderful visualization of the council and this big vast machinery that's never fully explained, which is, it is and it isn't, which is very well done. So it's like I really applaud the movie for this sort of, all models are wrong, some are useful. What's the right way to model how emotions are working at a very accessible way, both for children who can hardly grasp it, but also I think the adults watching the film or the kids who can now have this sort of shared language and reference point. So the idea of this core memory, if anyone's familiar with like the Telltale games or modern games, especially that have like, like, oh, like Jesse will remember this. Like it's sort of this, something happens and then it's crystallized into an orb, and then the orb tends to be colored with one of the emotions. And at least earlier on in the series, it's like it's a happy emotion, it's a joy emotion, it's a fear emotion, it's a disgust. And I just feel like this sense of creating, like this to me is sort of this is like, okay, this is sort of the level of like everybody's taught, okay, what's an electron and how does it relate to the proton or the neutron? Like, where is it? It's outside of this thing in the middle. And so to have this very simple model of a core memory and then putting an emotional label on it, that's interesting at a very fundamental teaching standpoint, or just like trying to create a basic differentiation. And I don't think it's great, but also like it's the way of doing that. It's interesting and it has implications, yes, for like computation or just like creating tenable I don't want to say quantification, but at least the variation, like making accessible variation to things that are pretty obscure or difficult to do. So I mean that's the whole angle of interest for the space. And what I will say on a one level is, unfortunately, I would not recommend seeing Inside Out 2 in theaters. And not because kids or anything, but because if you're trying to pay attention to, it's sort of like the idea of it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
like it's sort of like, think of like action adventure movie or like intense personal drama. Like there's this, okay, I'm in the theater, this sounds great, intense things are happening. And then I just don't equate that with a serene space at which I really want to understand my emotional like what's going on. Like it was too, like if you're trying to actually process this stuff in a deeper way, it's very jarring. The stepping away and thinking about the content, it's great. But the second version was very, like Sarrah mentioned, kids, and it was honestly, it wasn't even the kids though. Like I was kind of anticipating that, and there was kids, and there was some like just kept getting up in front of me all the time, but that wasn't the problem for me. The problem for me was this is a much better movie to just get at home or watch on a streaming thing and just be able to pause it and process it, because it was just so much stuff. Like if you're empathically engaging or you're trying to be like there, it just the way it worked out was like it was like a ride you wanted to get off and you couldn't.
Yeah.
It was because the tension in the film wasn't, it wasn't really, it didn't really feel external. It was like, okay, anxiety is taking over, and it wasn't really a rewarding film experience. But I think even that, like, that's an interesting commentary too, on it. But I think Inside Out 2, because Inside Out 2 deals with puberty, adolescence, and basically going to high school, and there's much more nuance and talk about suppressed emotions. Like this is all sort of cool psychology, emotional stuff, and I really be curious to see like Lisa Feldman Baird's take on it. I haven't seen anything like that yet. But like I've Jen found a few things like Paul Ekman and then the guy behind Internal Family Systems and these other things, sort of there's these. It's it was unpleasant in the theater. I'm happy to do it, I guess, because it's fun to talk about now. But it was unpleasant. But not saying not to go, but just sort of like when one of my friends saw it before me and said, "Oh, I'd have to watch it 3 times, a little bit too much, too fast." And I'm like, "Oh, well, are you just kind of being Debbie Downer about it or whatever?" And I know they're kind of like pessimistic about some things. And I go there and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, like it just doesn't. It's just a tough thing in the medium, and it's because you want it to be all exciting. But in reality, um, yeah, in reality, it's like if you're in there trying to like you know uh sort it out, it can be a lot. If you're in there for just the entertainment of it, but, definitely go. So I don't know. That's a long, winding discussion about that, but I think it's a really interesting example of trying to make it's one of the only things I can think of in popular culture that has any sort of opportunity for shared language between children and adults in very accessible ways about the topic. So I applaud them for that very much.
That's great. Yeah. So, I mean, are you planning on putting out a blog post on this or a presentation or?
I have sort of encouraged Jen to there's sort of a series of small posts that we've discussed. Some about just broad context, what is the inside out, some about the theory behind it.
Yeah.
And then Jen's really like I think what she might want to do longer term is Jen's very interested in sort of mental health, but also variation in mental health across culture or other nuance. One of the main research thrusts, or like, I don't know, themes or pillars or whatever in the mental health working group is how a lot of mental health is very monolithic in its advice or in its perception of what a person is or their experiences. So she really is interested in like one thing that I know she's interested in, and I'm encouraging her to do is I think it'd be good to I'm kind of in a stage of let's write about many like get used to writing about this first, and then like culminate in writing a piece on what would what's not quite like what would inside out to be for this specific community, but sort of bringing cultural nuance and cultural humility and cultural like awareness into it, and just like from this perspective, what how would this relate, or she's looked into how has this like subgroup like and their more like the community of that subgroup looked at what was their reaction inside out, and kind of going at that level of so on. Another interesting thing that she kind of found out about or some of it's at a cultural level, but also with a sense of when we've had really nice discussions about in the movie, joy is Riley, the main character's sort of like main emotion. And I don't know if I'm really curious if this is a theoretical choice or just sort of a accessible way of like communicating it. But in the mother and the father's main emotions, or like the ones at the center of their council when they're talking and showing those clips of their councils or internal emotional control space or whatever, is different. The mom's is like sadness, and the father's is anger. And so there's things to be said about variations in those things, or like how the setup is. And I'll throw all the way back to many things from Avery in the past, and hashtag psychological lopsidedness as a term of the non-uniformity of information processing or perhaps emotional processing, everything else too. But suffice to say, we've had conversations about, and Jen is looking into both individual variation and setup and how that kind of translates into the film, or the film as sort of a representative of the other things, and then also cultural or other backgrounds, like the way there's very different cultural takes on social norms, on social anxiety, on all those things. So yes, the short answer is yes. I'm encouraging, and I believe Jenny is working on some of these things already. Like this sort of a series of, I don't know, blog posts or just writing practice on inside out related theory and concepts around these topics.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good vein of research, rich vein of research, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it fits well with sort of things that Jen wants to do later in life. So I'm kind of excited to give this space to that. It'll be exciting to see what goes on there.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so yeah, why don't we move on to some things. So I wanted to, and I see Lukas is here. Hello, Lukas. But give a couple of announcements here and share some things.
Hi, how are you guys doing?
Hello. Hi. Yeah. So first thing is that Sarrah pushed her blog post on her latest project overview and progress report to the Medium. So this is the ORL Medium, and of course she's published a couple previous reports on her project. So this is the latest one on building blocks, the bottom-up approach. So this is her discussion of what kinds of things she's doing with autocode rover, SWE agent, and code R, and going over autocode rover in particular, and setting up this paradigm where she's setting up a large language model to do some sort of GitHub task, and then complete it through from sort of, I guess, conception to review by a maintainer. And so having those trying to model that in a large language model, so having those steps, walking through very specific things, and then having it in the sort of the parlance of a GitHub pull request. So that's good stuff. And then this post talks more about experiences with autocode rover and implementing that, which is this is, I think, very useful for working through some of these tools, especially when you're working on all these different types of large language models and using these tools to work on these problems. So implementation is pretty difficult, and that's really the challenge, getting everything to work. So congratulations to Sarrah for that. And I encourage people, if you want to contribute to the ORL Medium, please, set up a Medium account. You can write a blog post. So, if you have any ideas, I know Jesse's working on some things, and I'll probably be posting some things soon. But this is a tool that you can use to produce these research artifacts to get ideas out there. The next thing, I'd like to congratulate Lukas. He's working on he's doing an OpenWorm studentship. So congratulations to Lukas. We've been working on this for a while, trying to set up a studentship where he will work for the next 2 months on a data science problem, and kind of work through some of the details of that. So he's interested in working on the molecular biology and genetics of C. elegans, where we have a lot of these secondary databases. We have the NCBI, we have the protein database, we have EMBL, and these are all tools online that you can where labs that produce data, they host their data sets. And so these are repositories where you can go and you can find data sets on a wide range of different experiments that have been done in different species, different model organisms, assaying all sorts of genes and proteins. So you have a lot of high throughput data there. You can download and use you put together different data sets, and you can answer all sorts of questions. So Lukas is going to be working through sort of a pipeline for that. We're going to be working on doing some embryo modeling, taking the data, answering some questions, putting it in the context of an embryo model, and so forth. So we'll see what that looks like at the end of the process. He's already done some work on a paper that we've been working on in DevaWorm, and so he's going to use what has been done for that and kind of translate that into a more sort of reproducible pipeline, and that'll be something that people can use. So all organizations, when they do these types of things, they should have some sort of pipeline worked out, maybe some sort of standards for data analysis, for data retrieval, and so forth. So that's kind of going to be part of this. The other part is basically saying, what do we need to know? What kinds of things can we get from these databases? And how are they relevant to specific questions in development and in C. elegans biology more generally? So that's one thing that, in OpenWorm that is a paramount concern. And in fact, that's why the studentship was created, was to work with these secondary data sets. So labs will create they'll create data sets and they'll publish their data sets. And the reason to do that is because, there's a lot of money that goes into creating a data set. And those data can sit on someone's hard drive and be used maybe about 5% of their potential. You have labs that publish papers, but they don't get to put all of their data in the papers. They certainly aren't sort of answering every possible question that can be answered. So, producing a data set allows other groups to use the data to validate their own experiments, to ask questions that you can't ask necessarily in any one research group, because people have very different perspectives on things. So, and then we can also put data sets together and answer questions like, looking at cross-species comparisons, or looking at different, genes and proteins and how those things are, work together in, during biological regulation or during some process. So that's a very long-winded way of describing what we want to do. Lukas has a very specific set of goals that he wants to accomplish. He wants to work on interactive notebook to sort of build that or to show how that pipeline can be built and how to do that for people who want to do work later, or be able to use it in further research. So he asked me some questions about embryo modeling, and this morning I sent him some references to the work that's been done in DevaWorm. So I actually have on the DevaWorm website, I have a number of videos that kind of walk through some of the developmental modeling, and I sent him those videos. So if you go to the DevaWorm website, there's a media link, and those media that's a lot of videos that we have, and we have a number of videos that highlight some of the developmental modeling work that we've done. And so the other thing is that he was asking about JSON files and JSON formats. So I had a couple of things to talk about in terms of JSON, but more generally in terms of how we think about data and how we think about representing data, especially in the secondary data set world, where we're working on these kind of problems, trying to take data sets that have been collected in experimental settings and then using them for purposes of modeling organisms or modeling organs or modeling processes. So this could be very wide ranging from model organisms, modeling the phenotypes, to something like organoids, where you have you might want to model different aspects of organoids. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is this. This is from the OpenWorm documentation. This is data collection and representation. So this talks a little bit about how in OpenWorm, this doesn't include DivaWorm, by the way. This is just an OpenWorm. How they've approached data, data collection and representation. So what that means is that data is collected, using some sort of machine or device. It could be like movement tracking of worms. It could be, different molecular assays. It could be different types of cell positional information or cell nomenclature information. So this talks about how there's not one single data source for a simulation. So, in OpenWorm, we have a number of different simulations that are part of the simulation of the C. elegans. You have biophysics models, you have neural simulations, you have movement simulations, and so forth. So there are many different types of data that go into this. And so in that being the case, you have a lot of different, you basically have a set of numbers that get represented. You get some sort of metadata. So they could be labels, they could be annotations or whatever. And then putting those together in terms of translating from one type of representation to another. In other words, if you have a biophysics model, you have information about the physics, you have annotation, and then you have some other information, maybe in a neural model, about what neurons are doing. Maybe their biophysics there, but the biophysics of, say, like movement are very different from the biophysics of the connectome. So those all have to be translated over. And so one way to do that is to take these multiple data sets, put them together, and use some sort of representational scheme to sort of, give all the information to someone. So if someone wanted to, say, build a simulation of the worm, they would have, maybe biophysics data from the connectome, biophysics data for movement, maybe some movement tracking data, and putting all that together in a framework where you can just identify a number. It corresponds to this other number at a certain time point, and then you have some annotation telling you what cell it is, or what state the worm is in, or other types of things, maybe what kinds of genes we're talking about, or proteins, what those proteins are associated with, what those genes, what proteins those genes are associated with, and so forth. So there's a lot, there's a lot of complexity, and so having the right sort of representational scheme to put all that together is important. So we have different file formats and interfaces to the model, different data sets. There's no master representation of all the data incorporated into the model. Instead, our aim is to keep the model open to be able to cope with different data structures. So, we have to be flexible, because if we want to simulate this, we have to say, if we want to represent a connectome, it's usually some sort of matrix, like a connectivity matrix. If it's, some movement model of movement, it might be a time series that has, maybe different components that we want to extract. So we might have a raw time series with the numbers that go over time. We might have a decomposition of that time series, and we want to use both of those, but also map it to some of the biophysical models. And of course, molecular models are even different, yet still we have, counts, we have sequence data, and all sorts of things. So they say, consider the connectomics data. There are different useful ways to mine this data set. For example, in network X representation, so there's this tool called network X, and this is often used in the connectome. This is a network model where this is used to model the connectome as a complex graph. And this enables questions to be asked about first and second nearest neighbors of a given neuron. So when you have in a connectome, you usually have different cells that serve as sort of, something that's connected to other cells. And then those cells have neighbors. So if you want to, say, understand how some signal propagates across the connectome and produces a behavior, you might be interested in saying, okay, there's a focal cell, and then there's a cell that it's connected to, and then that cell is connected to another cell, and the signal propagates throughout the connectome and produces a behavior. But to do that, you have to have a representation of those relationships. So that's using network X. And then in contrast, there is something called an RDF semantic graph representation. So this is using RDF, which is a data format, and it's basically columnar. So it has like multiple columns. It's usually, 4 or 5 dimensional. And this is a semantic graph representation. So it's not just those connections, but also there's a semantic component. And this is useful for reading and writing annotations about multiple aspects of a neuron. So in an RDF model, we can take that network, we can annotate it. So we can say, like, for example, if there's a certain neuron that we're interested in, or a certain relationship between two neurons, we can actually add in, are there any papers that are key to understanding that relationship? Are there any properties that describe that relationship in more detail other than just being a connection, right? So if you have two neurons that are connected, you want to know as much about it as you can, but you want to have like some ground truth. You don't want to just say it's a correlation. You want to say, oh, that's significant, say in the movement circuit, or that's significant in, they're both being regulated by the same protein. They're part of a larger process, biological process, those sorts of things. So this is important here. So we have the RDF model, we have network X representations, and then the NeuroML representation, which is, of course, modeling neurons. This NeuroML is a neural modeling language or neuromodeling language. And this is often used in models of the connectome to sort of model morphology and simulation parameters. So NeuroML is a language, it's a markup language where they're able to put these sorts of information in a file and use it in a simulation, pass it into the simulation, and then the simulation unpacks that format and it has all the information available to it. So, and we'll talk about what JSON files are in a minute. But keep this in mind that like a lot of these different formats basically take all the information you need to run a simulation or to run an analysis, and it puts it into a format that's readable to a machine. I mean, you can have something that's human readable, but that isn't really useful to like running a simulation, because your computer needs to be able to parse those streams of information and put them into like a framework that it can use to model something efficiently. And we want to model something that, we don't want to spend like 6 years modeling the worm. I mean, we can do this depending on how, the size of your, the power of your computer or the power of the computational nodes you're using. We can do this in a reasonable amount of time. And we have our Blender container that you can download, and that runs pretty decently, but you still have a lot of problems with memory and getting those simulations run effective or efficiently. So that's why we want to use all these different file formats. So, and then lastly, a Blender representation, as I just mentioned, is a full 3D shape definition that can be used for calculations in 3D space. So we want to use all of these different representations, and using them separately leads to an ad hoc scripting for each representation. So this is a challenge for data integration. So if we use all these different representations separately, if we use, say, like a network X model, and then an RDF model, and a NeuroML model to model the connectome, and they're just different aspects of the connectome, we have these sort of ad hoc scripts being fed into the simulation. And as a result, it can't do a very efficient job of representing things or running the simulation, because you have you have the semantic information coming in, you have the basic connection information coming in, and so forth. And so it just kind of can't run efficiently at every time step. But if we can figure out ways to integrate the data better, then we can actually run these simulations faster and more efficiently. So one of the projects in OpenWorm is OW Meta, which is this project to create a unified data access layer. So it's taking all these different file formats, which are useful on their own and they're efficient on their own, and feeding them into a unified data access layer that then will feed things into the simulation efficiently and it'll allow the simulation to run faster. This allows the user to work with objects related to the biological reality of the worm, so we can represent not only the sort of the basic structure of the worm, but then what kinds of what kinds of biological processes are going on. If the worm is experiencing things in the environment, can we represent those things? If the worm is experiencing abnormal sorts of things like plasticity or starvation or whatever, then we can model those things as well. So yeah, and then these are the different data sets that are available through sort of in the adult C. elegans. This is not including DevaWorm. So we have data sets for DevaWorm, and those are in a separate place. So I can actually prepare for Lukas a list of our data sets, and I think, I've done this for GSOC, but I think it's useful for him to have some of these data sets and just sort of go over them. But I won't go over those right now. I'll send them to him later, maybe this week. But we have a number of data sets in the adult C. elegans where, they're represented in different ways. We have the virtual worm, which is a 3D atlas of C. elegans anatomy. We have the C. elegans connectome, which is this wiring diagram of connected neurons. So it's basically a connection matrix. The cell list of C. elegans. So the 3D atlas gives positional information and relational information. The cell list is merely just a list of cells. The ion channels used by C. elegans. So I think Lukas has looked at this data set where they talk about the ion channels in C. elegans. And again, this is more of a list. There's some functional information, but that's, usually a description of what an ion channel is or what it does, which is useful. But, again, there's all sorts of information. We can have annotations, or we can have sort of dynamical information like, traces, or, some sort of, something that represents the ion channels at different points in time. So, these things aren't static in the cell. For example, ion channels, we have ion channel expression. They, change their structure over the lifespan of C. elegans. They change their function sometimes. And so this is important to know kind of those details. But, we have to start somewhere, and this is basically characterizing these ion channels. And then there's the database of worm behavioral phenotypes. So this is the movement data where, they track worms using machine learning, and they can figure out how the worm moves, the different patterns of movement, and how they're related to different behaviors. So we have all these data here. And we have there are other sub-projects that are going on in OpenWorm that, really have focused on this data representation and kind of building these structures that allow us to have a uniform representation of the different data types. So this is really a focus of, what we do in OpenWorm. And yeah, this kind of goes through some of this. So this is the documentation. This is from the OpenWorm docs. And so that's an important thing, I think, for Lukas, but also it's more generally, I think, interesting for people trying to understand what OpenWorm is doing. Okay, that's what I want. Okay, so that's all I had for that. I wanted to go over that in more detail.
Yeah. If Lukas wants to say anything, go ahead. But I'm curious about that. Like, it's a lot of stuff that is sort of related to things that I've been exposed to. So I don't know if there's a way to help with that, or otherwise see what happens with it. I think that'll be a very interesting project, and definitely data science related in terms of wrangling data sets. So
Right.
yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, and Morgan said Ankur Sinha is leading the GSOC students working with NeuroML. So there are specific GSOC projects with respect to NeuroML and developing that file format type and some of the things around that. So that's something sponsored through INCF. So we'll hear more at CNS next month. Yeah, we'll probably talk about this more in the DVOR meetings. But in terms of JSON is a format that we use also, and it wasn't mentioned in there too much. But this is Java object or a notation, basically. That's what a JavaScript object notation. That's what JSON stands for. And it allows us to build this file. It's basically a file that describes something, and it will have the descriptors in it. So it's basically, if you can find an example of a JSON file, and we'll probably walk through this in more detail later, but basically it has everything formatted in JavaScript. It has all the details of your input data in JavaScript, and a computer can parse that information. So you have tags, you have the information within the tag, and then it'll go through and read this information, and it'll bring that into the simulation, and it'll do so in a way that's efficient for the computer. And it's something you can read as a human, but it's more meant for a machine to read it, so that the machine can then do the operations on the data. So that's what JSON is. And I think I sent him a couple things on JSON. I don't have them up here, but that's okay. We can go through those later as well. But I just sent him some basic reading. There isn't a whole lot on the web about JSON in terms of a tutorial or something, but there's some repositories where people have been working on this. And I know the movement data that we have in OpenWorm use JSON files quite extensively. So we can go through some of that as well later. So congratulations again to Lukas for that. Okay, so let me look here. Yeah, so I'm going to continue on. I have a couple more things here to talk about with respect to generative programming and some other things. So in our Slack, Paola pointed out this paper, and I thought it was interesting because it has to do with generative AI and sort of the categorical foundations of generative AI. And so she pointed this paper out in the general channel. And so I'll go over it a little bit and talk about it. This is called GAIA, Categorical Foundations of Generative AI, a preprint by Sarrah, Madhadevan, and this person is at Adobe at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst Adobe Research, and so they're interested in the categorical foundations of generative AI. Specifically, we investigate a generative AI architecture of GAIA that lies beyond backpropagation, the long-standing algorithmic workhorse of deep learning. Backpropagation is at its core a compositional framework for unsupervised learning. It can be conceptualized as a sequence of modules where each module updates its parameters based on information it receives from downstream modules, and in turn transmits information back upstream to modules that guide their updates. So GAIA is based on a fundamentally different hierarchical model. So what they kind of describe backpropagation as this compositional framework where you have a sequence of modules. Each module updates its parameters, and then it sends things upstream. And there's this sort of upstream sort of cascade. Things are collected in downstream modules. There are modules that are upstream that update their parameters. And then they have this feedback mechanism where information is sent back to guide updates. So it's a classic feedback loop in that sense. Now, this is, GAIA is basically a different type of hierarchical model. Modules in GAIA are organized into a simplical complex. So yeah, this is backpropagation. Then we get into GAIA. Modules in GAIA are organized into a simplical complex. So these are sort of these topological, like kind of like graphs. So if you have shapes in a graph, this is a simplical complex. So each simplical complex acts like a manager of a business unit. It receives updates from its superiors and transmits information back to its n+1 subsimplical complexes that are its subordinates. So, you have this idea that, you have, maybe in backpropagation, you have this basic feedback loop, the way we think of it kind of in cybernetics. So we have backprop, and then GAIA, which is over here. So in backprop, we have this sort of cascade of different modules. They go upward to these different modules, and they collect information down here and go upward. So it is hierarchical in this sense so far. And then, but there's feedback between this module and this module. So it's like updating itself. So you have information coming in, information being passed up to this one, and then it just updates the state here. The feedback is a time thing, it's a temporal update. And so that's where we are with backprop. In GAIA, though, we have a different kind of hierarchical system. We have these simplical complexes. And a simplical complex is basically where you have a shape that's represented in a graph. So you have, say, for example, this diamond, which is a 4 simplex. So you have 4 nodes here. They're connected this way. These can be bidirectional. And this forms a simplical complex. And they use this in graph theory often to, sort of represent different topologies. So you can have triangles, you can have diamonds. They're, they call them 3 and 4 and 5 simplices. So when they say n simplex, the n is just the number of nodes in the simplex. And so they suggest that this is kind of like an org chart, basically, where you have a manager and subordinates. And so these directional connections could be like subordinates reporting to managers. And these can be just organized in any, any sort of set of pathways you want. It's just that there's some sort of like, order in the way information is passed. So it could be passed upward, it could be passed downward, but there's this sort of subordinate and managerial relationship. That's basically what they're getting at with this paper. So it receives updates from its superiors and transmits information back to its n+1 subsimplical complexes that are its subordinates. To ensure the simplical generative AI organization behaves coherently, GAIA builds upon the mathematics of higher order category theory of simplical sets and objects. So there's a whole category theory. We use simplical sets and objects, or we use simplical complexes in graph theory. And sometimes people will take a graph and they'll find all the simplices of a certain order. So n simplex, they might find all triangles in a graph topology, or all diamonds in a graph topology. And they'll say that those are sort of these motifs that mean something. And so when you can discover those, then you can, say something about the structure of a graph. In this case, we're looking at higher order category theory. So we're looking at sort of subsets and other types of properties of the graph. So we're looking at different types of categorical relationships instead of just these simplices that are organized into shapes. And so this tells us something about kind of the structure of the network and how information is passed through it. So computations in GAIA, from query answering to foundation model building, are posed in terms of lifting diagrams over simple objects. The problem of machine learning in GAIA is modeled as a horn extension of simple sets. Each subsimple complex tries to update its parameters in such a way that the lifting diagram is solved. And so they talk about lifting diagrams in this paper. Traditional approaches used in generative AI using backpropagation can be used to solve inner horn extension problems. And so they get into all this is very jargony, and it kind of goes through some of how this works. There these weakly ordered preserving mappings. The top level structure can be viewed. The top level structure can be viewed as a combinatorial factory for constructing, manipulating, and destructing complex objects that can be built on a modular components defined over categories. So basically, you can create different structures in the network that can be manipulated or destroyed, which is interesting. So there are a lot of structures that get defined in terms of, if you're working in a certain problem type or problem space, and you can modify the network over time. The second layer of GAIA defines the building blocks of generative AI models as universal coalgebras over categories that can be defined using current generative AI approaches, including transformers that define a category of permutation equivariant functions and vector spaces, structured state space models that define a category over linear dynamical systems, or image diffusion models that define a probabilistic coalgebra or ordinary differential equations. So this gets very much into sort of, there's a lot of math involved in this. And then, let's see, the third layer in GAIA is a category of elements over a relational database that defines the data over which foundation models are built. So there's this relational element. And I think there's a lot of, it's a very complex paper, but I think there's a lot here that's relevant to sort of, the good regulator theorem, as we'll see in the paper that we have yet to review for that, and a lot of other things with respect to relational systems and things like that. So it's definitely an interesting paper. This is sort of their model here. They show these lifting diagrams, which I guess are just kind of representations of these simple complexes. And so, they kind of get into the details here. They show the hierarchical framework. So you actually have here this hierarchical framework of simplexes. So you have, say, for example, a 3 simplex and a 2 simplex and a 1 simplex and a 0 simplex. And those are all sort of hierarchical. So the 3 simplex is at a higher level of the hierarchy than a 2 simplex. And so you can move down from 3 simplexes down in complexity to these 0 simplexes, which I guess are like just nodes in the network. But you're able to sort of organize those in a way that's functional, and they act as a business unit in a company. That's the metaphor that they use. But basically, there's a mathematics to this. And it allows you to sort of build these hierarchies into sets and objects and things that you would need to process data coming into the system. So this is a pretty interesting paper. It has a lot of connections to some of the things we're doing, but I don't know if we can get our heads around it enough to do anything interesting with it. But it does raise a lot of questions. There's that connection to category theory, of course, that we've talked about in the past. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is this work on program synthesis and large language model creativity. So I see that that Sarrah had to leave, but I have some, this will be relevant to some of her interests in large language models. So the first thing that this kind of brings up is this idea of program synthesis and deep learning. And this is based on Francois Chollet's work. And this is Sarrah. I don't know who that is, but anyways, they said, here are my notes on Francois Chollet's neat explanation of the differences between deep learning and program synthesis. So Francois Chollet was making connections between deep learning and program synthesis, and the advantages and disadvantages of each, and how they fit together to build AGI. So in deep learning, your underlying model is a differentiable curve. So you have this curve that has this sort of aspect where you can differentiate it and use calculus to get, like if you're looking at gradient descent, you can get information about that function at any point in time and how that function evolves over time. So in deep learning, this is what we're doing with a differentiable curve. And that's, of course, one type of computational learning. And in program synthesis, which of course is not deep learning, but it's a different type of sort of problem space, your model is a discrete graph of operators. You're picking from a set of operators and structuring it into that program. So if you look at this model here, this shows the difference, this picture. So deep learning is where you have this surface, this gradient descent surface, where you go from sort of the surface to this minima space, or this minima point down here in the space. And so your path here is this curve that you see in black, where it explores the space and it tries to minimize its loss. And so in doing so, it produces this curve that's differentiable. So that means it's a continuous curve that describes the space going down to this minimum, or this minima, or this minimal point. And so we can differentiate this curve and do calculus on it and figure out like what the loss is and characterize this as a loss function, giving us a good rigorous mathematical background for it. Now, if you're kind of linking this to program synthesis, it's a little bit harder because you have this different problem space, or it's this different type of problem. And so this is how they represent program synthesis in that space. So what you're doing here, instead of trying to minimize your error in this space and getting a differentiable function, is you have this combinatorial search that happens. Your model is a discrete graph of operators. You're picking from a set of operators and structuring that into a program. Purple path is this path through that space and putting together these different operators and linking them into a program. And so that's what you're doing here. So then this has implications for the amount of compute and data needed for each. We want to use deep learning to do program synthesis, but we can't because there are different types of problems. They use different types of underlying representations. So in deep learning, your learning engine is gradient descent, which is very compute efficient. You have a very informative feedback signal about where the solution is. So you have this feedback signal, kind of where you were, you kind of know where you're going because it's a step that's minimizing things, and you can keep track of that, and it's actually pretty easy to know kind of. You also know where the solution is because it's the absolute minimum, the global minimum. Of course, sometimes in spaces that are very rugged, you can't really find the global minimum, but you can use the information that you have from your previous point to sort of find that global minimum. So there's this very strong feedback signal. In program synthesis, in fact, in deep learning, you need a dense sampling of the data distribution to get, to have an efficient sort of minimization process. Because again, if you have this very rugged space, you might get stuck in a local minimum, and that's not the global minimum, and you can't, you can't minimize your error enough, and the program, the deep learning solution isn't optimal. So you have this informative feedback signal, but you have a very data inefficient process. So if you have a lot of data about your space, your problem, you're okay. If you don't, then you don't. In program synthesis, your learning engine is combinatorial search. This is extremely data efficient. I believe because the problem space is inherently more constrained. That's his editorial. But it's extremely compute inefficient because the search space is massive. So in this case, sometimes it's data efficient because your problem is constrained. You may want to just write a program that does a certain thing, and maybe there are only a finite set of operators that you can use to represent that problem. On the other hand, you have this compute inefficient issue because the search space is potentially massive. How does this apply to AGI? So it talks about deep learning being great for system 1 thinking. Discrete program search is great for system 2 thinking. So you kind of use the system 1 and system 2 model, where system 1 and system 2 are different ways of thinking. There's this sort of surface thinking and there's this deep thinking, and links that to system 1 and system 2 cognition. AGI will likely require a combination of both approaches. Chalet expects that an AGI system will have an outer program that does program synthesis, and it will use deep learning to assist it. So basically, you'll do program synthesis by running some sort of combinatorial search, but also use deep learning not as like doing program synthesis as deep learning, but deep learning as a way to sort of help constrain that search space. And then there's this blog post, Programming, Generating Code and Program Synthesis, the Changing Paradigms in Creating Software. So this talks a little bit about ChatGPT and using AI to sort of do program synthesis. And so, large language models, of course, run on the basis of a transformer. And, so we have these networks that are doing this sort of essentially things that are related to program synthesis, building these language models. And then, of course, you can generate code, but the question is, can you synthesize a program efficiently using GPT? And so it's already possible for GPT-3 derived AI models to do some interesting things. So there's this model called Codex that generates code and allows you to build programs that way. And there have already been products that can do this, like GitHub Copilot or CodePilot, and open source ones like GPT Code Clippy. Have we really reached the holy grail? How about generating the program instead of stopping at the code? So, we can generate code, and the code might make sense and it might not, but we also want to generate programs. And so this is where they kind of takes this next step and talks about program synthesis and how computers generate programs automatically by telling them what we want, not just the code that we will need to compile, but the programs that can run directly. So we had a comment here. Did we have the original Chalet discussion about this? Well, it's somewhere on X. I don't know where it is, but it's he has I don't know if he has a blog. Maybe he put it up there, but so
yeah, definitely curious about that, and I feel like I don't know if I'm going to do it, but in Infinite Time, Jesse was like, "Oh man, let's not just compare the original tweet to System 1, System 2 stuff. Let's compare it to MetaBrains and all of our work in that space, and like use it as a means by which to kind of connect some stuff in our sense." I don't know if I'm gonna have time to do that, but that's like, I think that fits a bit with sort of the philosophy of computation stuff, but also this, I don't know what to call these space where like I don't know, MetaBrain stuff, and then Jan LeCun's like, oh well, I think there's 6 different components, like that. This all seems to be in that space, and I don't know what that space is, but
yeah, I've been putting that in Dev AI.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's where I put that ARC stuff before, yeah, and like the machine learning street stuff.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to classify because it's like, what is this useful for? Not just what it is. And I think it's useful for a lot of things. We're working on like, the cybernetics stuff, but also like MetaBrains, and we can't forget about that. And I think that would be useful in some way here. So, yeah. So
there's definitely a conversation like to be demarcated, and maybe it's just Dev AI, but like, I'm glad that we're continuing to mention that one.
Yeah. A couple weeks ago, I did like when I just did like an update for the lab. So there's this interview with Alison Gopnik and Melanie Mitchell on sort of the usefulness of development and thinking about AI more generally. I haven't linked in the description of that video. That was like 2 weeks ago. So, that's something to read as well. But anyways, yeah, this is an LA review of books, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, this is it. So that's a really interesting thing to dive into because there's just a lot there, and they kind of have a very wide-ranging conversation on, intelligence and development and kind of these higher level representations, these symbolic representations, and so forth. Something else. So that's program synthesis, and that's interesting. But we also think about like what large language models can do, and so there's a couple papers I wanted to talk about with respect to creativity. And so creativity is a really interesting topic because famously, of course, we like to say that large language models maybe have some level of human-like intelligence. But one of the things about human-like intelligence is that it's not just about memorizing facts and synthesizing things, but there are things like creativity and emotion, as we talked about before. So there are all these things that are kind of like you would expect from an intelligence that we can't necessarily say are hallmarks of large language models. But in this paper, they talk about divergent creativity in humans and large language models. So they kind of frame creativity in terms of this thing that humans and large language models maybe have or don't have, and being able to compare those two systems. So you have humans and large language models. Of course, the problem with comparing those two is that we don't really know what humans or large language models are doing necessarily, but we do know that they produce a behavioral output, and so we can sort of analyze those maybe subjectively, but still we can make comparisons. So the recent surge in the capabilities of large language models have led to claims that they are approaching a level of creativity akin to human capabilities. This idea sparked a blend of excitement and apprehension. However, a critical piece that has been missing in this discourse is a systematic evaluation of large language model creativity, particularly in comparison to human divergent thinking. Okay, so this is, I guess, like human creativity or human divergent thinking. I don't really know what that means. To bridge this gap, we leverage recent advances in creativity science to build a framework for the in-depth analysis of divergent creativity in both state-of-the-art large language models and a substantial data set of 100,000 humans. So this is a pretty large human data set, and there's a lot of variation in what people are doing in terms of creativity. It's really hard, for one thing, to sort of characterize creativity. I mean, it's kind of like one of these we know it when we see it type things. And so what does it mean to be creative? What are the sort of the hallmarks of like innovation or making things kind of spontaneously? I mean, there are a lot of ways you can define creativity. So I think having a huge human data set can give us sort of a baseline for that. But then again, maybe not. We have to really kind of know we have to have a really robust definition of creativity. And then we can maybe compare it to what large language models are doing, which we don't know what they're doing under the hood necessarily, or how they're arriving at these outputs. But we can make some, I guess, good guesses. We found evidence suggesting that large language models can indeed surpass human capabilities in specific creative tasks, such as divergent association and creative writing. So in this case, they're just saying that humans can do creative writing, large language models can do better creative writing, and that's kind of, I don't know if that means like it can generate more bullshit, but I mean, that could be the, but in divergent association, that's kind of like, that's interesting, but I don't know if that's really a hallmark of creativity, because it's like I can just make, spurious associations, and that's great. But again, what does it mean to be creative? Is it like more focused than that? Our quantity. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this is the beauty of these kinds of discussions, in terms of actually trying to pin down what some of these words mean, computationally or in practice, as opposed to our what's the colloquial way of using these words?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it's basically like we know it when we see it. Like, I think it's creative. I mean, that's creative. If you build if you paint an abstract painting, that's creative. How do you get to that? Is it just you just start slapping paint on a canvas, or?
Yeah. I mean, and this was, remember when Stable Diffusion came out?
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, yeah, there was a lot of, how creative is this, or how many times do I need to kind of repeat this, and before I find something creative, right? Where people were, essentially using their eye to pick out the creative output from hundreds, pressing the button 100 times.
Yeah. And I think, it's like, and you can have things that are creative, but they're not intentional. Like, and I don't know if that makes a difference. Maybe in humans it doesn't work that way. Maybe it's like you just spontaneously do something that's creative. It might be that you have a very fixed process. Like artists will have a very fixed process for creating something. But you can also have improvisation where you just kind of generate stuff and you see how it flows. And so that's another thing to think about. Like, there are different definitions of creativity within creativity, right?
Right. It also slightly reminds me of William James and his varieties of religious experience and kind of just like how obsessed he was with like automatic writing, for instance.
Right.
like these outputs that where the mind is supposed to be kind of out of the picture. Anyway.
Yeah. So our quantitative benchmarking framework opens up new paths for the development of more creative large language models, but it also encourages more granular inquiries into the distinctive elements that constitute human inventive thought processes compared with those that can be artificially generated. So this paper really kind of goes through this kind of comparison. It's really like, again, you're defining creativity in maybe a certain way, maybe not. I think they're kind of getting to this idea of divergent thinking, where there's this divergence from a plan, or this divergence from other like models. So human brains might diverge from a cultural plan, or might generate new things. Same thing with large language models, where you have language models that are behaving differently. Again, the question is that something that we want, or is it something that's actually creative, or is it just generating stuff and there's no like underlying aspect to it? Because there are models of improvisation. There are processes that sometimes artists will go through to create things. There are a lot of, it's not just a haphazard mishmash of things. And so that's, and it kind of goes through how we think about this idea of divergent thinking. So, so there's something called the alternative uses test, in which people generate novel uses for common objects. And so, large language models, they've used this alternative uses test, but it's not been really conclusive. In some cases, there are no overall significant differences between large language models and humans. And so the results might be explained by inherent challenges in the methodology. So this is one method. There's also semantic distance, which is a key component of creative thought. So this is where you have different things like the divergent association task, in which people are asked to generate a list of 10 words that are as semantically distant from one another as possible. So they'll take words and they'll have some semantic distance metric where the meaning has some level of divergence. And then they'll build a network of words, and they'll say, okay, well, let's take a bunch of words that are as semantically distant from each other as possible, and let's see if people can make connections between them, and kind of cover a larger semantic space. So individuals who are more creative tend to cover a larger semantic repertoire, resulting in a larger mean semantic distance between the words, while the DAT predominantly probes creativity through language. Its results have been found to correlate with other established creativity tests, such as the alternative uses test. And so we can use something like divergent association specifically for large language models because it correlates with the alternative uses test and other tests as well. So that's kind of what they're going with here. There's also divergent semantic integration, which is a measure of cosine similarity between pairs of successive word embeddings presented in a textual narrative. This approach was implemented in light of more recent advances in language modeling, allowing the computation of context-dependent word embeddings. And so this actually correlates strongly with human ratings of creativity in short narratives. So they kind of talk about the methods here that they're using, and then they're showing their results. And I don't want to get too much into this paper because I have other papers I want to talk about, but that's one of the papers here is thinking about divergent creativity. This article is a robot walks into a bar. Can language models serve as creativity support tools for comedy? So this is the idea of creating comedy.
Yeah. That's Corey Matheson. Yeah.
Is Corey Matheson is from DeepMind.
Well, so one, there's I think 3 brothers, and so the others, a cognitive neuroscience professor at Alberta.
Okay.
And the third is doing something too. So, you can only imagine family gatherings.
Yeah.
But yeah, Corey did, what's that organization like Creative Destruction? Anyway, he's with one group that was kind of, anyway, he also does improv.
Okay, yeah. That's the important thing, yeah.
That's what I know from. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. They're trying to basically, I guess, creative support tools for comedy. I don't know what that is. Let's see. So they interviewed 20 professional comedians who perform live shows in front of audiences and who use artificial intelligence in their artistic process as part of 3-hour workshops on AI times comedy, which I guess equals tragedy in time or something. I don't know. But this is basically where they're using some sort of artificial intelligence to help in their creative process. So it's not actually relying on these tools, it's using them as part of that process. So this was at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in August 2023 and online. So the workshop consisted of a comedy writing session with large language models, a human-computer interaction questionnaire to assess the creativity support index of AI. So we talked about that. And a focus group interrogating the comedians' motivations for and processes of using AI, as well as their ethical concerns about bias, censorship, and copyright. Participants noted that existing moderation strategies used in safety filtering and instruction-tuned large language models reinforced hegemonic viewpoints by erasing minority groups and their perspectives, and qualified this as a form of censorship. So yeah, that was, I guess, Jesse. Something to say about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's just very relevant to a lot of stuff that I'm looking at. So
yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So this is very consistent with like a lot of the stuff in the ethics literature on like how generic large language models are trained on basically our society, and it kind of perpetuates the biases of the society. And so this is important to understand that when you're using it as part of this creative process. At the same time, most participants felt that large language models did not succeed as a creativity support tool. By producing bland and biased comedy tropes, akin to cruise ship comedy material from the 1950s, but a bit less racist. Okay, that's great. That's interesting to note, because that's like, obviously, if you trained an AI or a large language model on, say, like sitcoms, it would have like certain tropes, certain themes that would come up again and again. It would pick up on those themes and reinforce them. This is interesting, this phrase, just the way it's stated. Cruise ship comedy material from the 1950s, but a bit less racist. So,
not racist.
Well,
Like,
yeah.
yeah. This reminds me of the Cards Against Humanity developers did a live stream of their writing team versus an LLM.
Yeah. Oh, really?
which is, it was a fun event. They were raising money for something.
Right.
It was for a good cause.
That's great.
Yeah.
Or working. Okay.
Definitely worth Googling Corey though, or checking Corey's Google Scholar for other. I know he's done other interesting, creative uses of machine learning. Because of his work in improv.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is like, I think, a wide open area. I mean, obviously, there's the study. This is like the human computer interaction study of this. There's also the sort of the more technical aspect of like, can we build something that's creative, and what does that mean? There's the human and machine comparisons. So, how do we say that, like, what's, defining creativity in humans, and then, okay, do machines reflect that? And then, of course, working with machines in hand with humans, and, if those things are helpful or not. So this work, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and like you were saying, like, well, I'll know it when I see it.
Yeah.
Like comedy is kind of one of those things, and,
right?
And also, just talking about Dev AI, it's anybody who has kids knows that they go through this stage,
Oh yeah.
Like my daughter is kind of there right now, and where she's trying to tell jokes.
Yeah.
And she's really just kind of feeling me out in terms of like, is this funny?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you're kind of just stating facts.
Yeah.
This isn't a joke yet. Yeah. And anyway, yeah. So it's really, again, super interesting when you kind of try to get down to defining in a more accurate way what we're talking about with comedy or humor. Things like that.
Yeah. So to finish this up, they do mention that our work extends scholarship about the subtle difference between, on the one hand, harmful speech, and on the other hand, offensive language as a practice of resistance, satire, and punching up. So there's a certain structure to like something that's funny. Usually, if it's like making fun of, like punching down, it's like that's not considered funny. Punching up is considered more funnier to most people, I guess. So there are certain rules in humor that are like expected by the audience, and if you violate those, then it's not considered funny. So I mean, there are a lot of social rules that the AI has to be aware of, and that's part of the maybe part of the problem here. So
sure, it'd be really good to look at this and then revisit. Stuart Lee is kind of a very famous comedian in the UK, but he does great talks about writing and kind of like about his process. I know he went to Oxford. He gave a talk at a college, like I can't remember now, but St. Catherine's or something like that. But Yeah, just in terms of trying to his attempt to try and define what he's doing.
Yeah. This is just a kind of a finishing thing. This is data from Star Trek Next Generation painting. And this was a theme in this show because like Data actually at one point did like stand-up comedy and it wasn't funny at all. He would just like make jokes that were like observations, like you said, and people weren't laughing. And he couldn't figure out why they weren't laughing. So he would go around to the different crew members and ask, like, why isn't this funny? And they couldn't really tell him why. I mean, they kind of had an answer, but it wasn't like, they couldn't give him instructions on how to be funny necessarily. So I think that is an interesting kind of point. And then, of course, Data's painting here. And, a similar thing can happen with painting. Are you painting something that's creative or is it just kind of a facsimile of something else? And, there are a lot of things that, if you had an Android doing them, they would be a lot, the Android might not understand the social conventions, the sort of process, which we take for granted. And for humans, it's procedural knowledge, right? It's not descriptive. You can't describe how it is to be funny, but you can be creative, right?
Yes. There's a lot of things to say, and I'll say them when we're done talking about this stuff. So I don't know if there's more you want to say.
Well, I think that's it for me.
Okay. One of the things that I'll say that major shout out to Avery, who is not here, but is always with us, at least always with me in spirit. I think one of the things that something that totally jumps out to me that Avery is working on, and it's sort of this, I'm only at liberty to say things, and I only understand so much of it as well. But I think it's tied a little bit. There's an extreme version of my comment in the chat about are humans that creative, but I think I want to tag Avery here and say Avery is doing some really, really, really cool, deep stuff in their time about identifying like why I think there's something about humor, something about improv, something about creativity that is absolutely not about, it's totally not I don't want to use the word intellectual or mental, but all about circumstance and context. And and why like there's an element that is very much implicit reference to other things, not just like world model, but actually like even punching up or punching down. I think is a great way to think about this, because punching up or punching down is a relative it's a very specific kind of a divide. It's a very specific kind of alternative that requires a very specific context. So shout out to Avery, who is developing, I would say, theories, but also like they're working on a theory about like a lot of Avery's work is sort of this almost like applied, I mean not applied, but like a phenomenological investigation of certain experiences and how that like what is the spectrum of experience in this space. That's what Avery, a lot of Avery's theory work is about, that at a certain level. And it's fascinating to be like around somebody who just sort of comes up with this stuff as a byproduct of, So I'll leave it at that and say that's awesome, and there's something there. And then I'm kind of in the rest of however long I talk about this, there's sort of the controversial hat about humans and creativity, but then also like there's part of the discussion. I had such mixed feelings when you're going over the paper, because one of it's like, and also I want to say something about data later too. But the paper that we just went over, I had very mixed, not mixed, but like conflicting, I guess, feelings in the sense of one, yeah, absolutely. I want to look into this guy, the background in improv. I've mentioned a lot of things about D&D and creativity a few weeks ago. I'm not going to rehash it here, but I think it's a fascinating space, and the ability to communicate across those things is really interesting. But also, sort of, there's a bit of it where it's like creativity is sort of talked about like measuring intelligence and measuring creativity in that way of like, okay, like, are we a little bit of like talking about creativity like it's a certain either amount that you have, or like a lot of the things you said about, oh, is like, do you press the button 100 times and see when do you see the creativity in it? It's sort of like there's a very weird and uncomfortable way of talking about creativity or intelligence or like sort of like the IQ level or the creativity quotient of something. It's like not even in the sense of being against those metrics, but more like I have such a strong pull away from that at times, where it's much more about what there's sort of a valence or a magnitude of appeal of creativity that affects a certain, like what is creativity to different people is, it's not uniform. Like what is a relative creativity versus what is old hat and tiresome, and like if you've been watching me for a long time, not that interesting to say, but it's like there's all of those things are at play, but then also sort of like what is our model for creativity, and are humans there's a certain, to put on the controversial hat fully, that I said I think there's one painful approach to the creativity common of humans is like, man, like humans in certain domain spaces, there's a lot of like variability, but in many other ones, it's extremely there's so much monolithicness, let's say, and so I even feel like creativity, if you change the bounds of as a human or as an entity or as a whatever, like there's some weird relevance to embodiments, but also social stuff, and it goes in all these different directions. And it's just, I don't know. There's sort of a really substantial part of the paper that is like, okay, yes, and there's also these avenues where I feel like, and so that's great. But those are just all the many different reactions that I had to that.
Yeah, I think domain specificity is really interesting, because if you think about, like, we talked about large language models and some of the tests they use there, and you can do some very specific tests with large language models and human, like, kind of linguistic creativity. So you can look at, like, vector spaces, and you can look at, different semantic distances and things like that. And it's pretty easy to represent sort of, a standard output versus a creative output and say, okay, this is more creative than that. And then that's in that domain. And if we move to a domain like painting or, some sort of visual art, that's a totally different space. You're going to use a totally different type of model. You're going to use a large language model. You might use something like, some sort of neural network, or, some sort of generative model where you can generate images. And then, you can evaluate those, but it's a different maybe set of criterion for what's creative or not. And then, of course, we have the false positives, which we don't think about in creativity. But like I mentioned before, you have, how do you know you're doing something creative versus something that's just kind of gibberish? And I say that in kind of a judgmental way, because, if you think about like a Jackson Pollock painting, it's like throwing paint at a canvas, and that's valuable too. That's creative, but it's is that really just maybe kind of like just random behavior. If you saw that in a machine, would you think that that was creative? I mean, I guess that's, and so it's a very slippery criterion too. So you can't just say something is creative because it diverges from the norm. I don't know,
Right.
or maybe you can. I don't
Exactly.
know. Yeah.
And there's so much, like, you can read. I forget the name of it. One of my friends would always tell me about it. But like, you can read a piece of literature, and if it's your first time reading it, it's one thing. If not even just like the first pass, but some books you read multiple times, sure. But also, like, there's even I think even the like the art comment, or even like Picasso or whatever, a lot of their alleged creativity is in the context of the entire history of the domain of that being an artiste, of being a writer. A lot of writing is, or very impressive writing is, why is it impressive or creative? Why is it of substance? Because there's a implicit connection to other things, whether it's other artifacts that have been made that the user, the agent, is exposed to, or it touches upon an experience. The universal human condition stuff. That too. So I almost think creativity is one thing, but I think almost a more salient. Like, I want to override some of this stuff and say, well, some of the I don't really like the word value, but the compulsion of feeling something of substance about it has to do with, like, I don't associate that with creativity. I see that as more connection, like resonance. I guess I guess I'm saying the word resonance.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to go in the Fuchs sense of it, but like, there's a resonatory, like, oh yeah, there's a strong communication between the what the art or the experience of the writing, the artifact, the thing that's happening, and inside the person as well. And I think is that creativity? I don't know. Like, I'm kind of, and in this moment, I'm poo-pooing the idea of creativity, and more, well, it seems to be more, what does it mean, like, phenomenologically inside the person? Do they find it creative? Do they find it interesting? Does it speak to them in some way? And so that we don't, that's a different angle, perhaps.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. Excuse me. We haven't. I don't think we brought up the. What's this? The author's name. The Berkeley linguist. He did the paper. Does large language models, refute Chomsky?
Oh.
Begins with a P. Anyway, you've got a new paper. Language is primarily a tool for communication rather than thought.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I saw a reference to that somewhere.
Yeah.
Did I share that? Did you share that? I saw that somewhere.
I put this in Dev AI. Dev AI has a bit of a catch-all for me,
right,
in terms of
okay, I see
things
it.
that don't fit other places. But so one, just getting at this this discussion about creativity and people working, again, like James working on automatic writing, others in terms of trying to inspire writers to get over writer's block or things like that. Like,
right.
These again, just this idea that, like, the wellspring is something beyond language. It's something else, and that what we're trying to do is to then find the words, right? And that those words can convey the experience to the to another person.
Yeah.
And being that's the only, that is our only communication system. And I a little bit maybe more grounded on this is something that I thought was really interesting. Just was someone using language to explore, to help people explore smell space.
Okay.
and so there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of those being, like people just being unused to finding words to express experiences, complex experiences, right? And yet they're, it's funny how if you're trying wines, like if you ask somebody like, what does that taste like, and they'll be like, tastes like red wine or something like that. But when somebody with experience gives you some words and gives you some words that capture just say little parts of that, about like, hints of this, hints of that, and your recognition, of that, like, oh yeah, that is my experience.
Yeah.
Like that I thought was interesting, just in terms of that maybe we are just unpracticed in describing some experiences. Yeah.
Right.
And is that in an article, or where is that? Is that
yeah, that's so. I put that on Celsius Slack because we're doing a special workshop on synths, like synthetic bio of synth. But I'll find it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think one of my current fascinations is exactly, I said it earlier today, but it's going from a space of a certain degree of nuance, furthering nuance and alternatives that offer new degrees of specificity, like that, whatever, like that's a super, like, everything is that, but like I'm really curious to see people talking about that, because I need to find much better language about it to just get my grounding in it. But like, even the smell, like the example of I think wine test is a great example, because haven't had that much of it over time, and I'm always really agitated about, like, this. The description says this, but to me it means this. That is like, it's this very uncoordinated space that's clumsy and awkward, and I think that's a really relevant place for me to like think about it, but also to try to express to other people like the degree of nuance and what it's like to be able to do that. And I think there's also it's different when it's sort of there's something also specifically about like tenability or like within reach of it, because people already have the spectrum or the range or the domain space of smells or tastes somewhat, like you're coming into the situation with a lot of those points demarcated or have reference points. Oh, this is the far end of the shower spectrum, or and it's sort of like, but there's a separate thing of expanding that whole space that if it doesn't happen first, adding fancy language about it won't make a difference. Yeah. So I think that's whatever that is, that's something, and I think that's something I want to look forward to.
Yeah, sort of extrapolation versus interpolation. You can interpolate within that space versus having a new experience that's outside of that space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I've only got a poster so far, actually. So I just put it in Dev AI. Okay. So it's a postdoc in I forget the brain imaging center, but anyway, you can zoom in on the poster behind it.
Oh yeah, the image here. Okay.
Yeah.
In odor is not worth 1,000 tokens.
He's probably doing something much more neural. Like there was a great. I forgot to post this, but the brain meeting is the Functional Imaging Lab Institute of Neurology meeting in London. Had Chris Summerfield this week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, really interesting, talking about the matches between artificial neural networks and biological neural networks in terms of processing. I think this is much more aligned with that. But as someone who's got family members who have wineries and I think there's something there in terms of trying to give people, like the experience people have when you start to give them a language of expression for experiences that they absolutely recognize once you give them those words, and it's actually just something that you need to practice. And it's a little like Nuringer talking about reinforcement of random behavior, where he's just like you can't sit people, you don't give people a violin and expect them to start playing. Like you have to guide them. And teach them, but then they can absolutely find that expressivity. And anyway, I think it interacts with the what's the Piandopoulos? No, what's the Berkeley?
I'm going to get into that in a minute, but okay, So this is interesting because we did a little bit of work on like associating like odors with like other types of stimuli, like light stimuli in Bradenburg vehicles. And so there might be something here. I know they're using large language models here, but like kind of parsing that out and what kinds of models can we use to do these associations. So we could use Bradenburg vehicles. We could also use MetaBrains to look at that problem. Yeah.
It's got some really, from a sensory perspective, it's really interesting in the kind of the complexities of context and how context changes the experience. Yeah. So with taste and smell, previous tastes and smells can absolutely change your kind of local experience of that, right? And but you can do this in a still kind of psychophysics way,
right?
Right. Which is really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get to this before we go. I pulled up the paper. So this is Piantadosi, I guess is his name. Stephen Piantadosi. Yeah, he did a couple of talks at the I can't remember what that was, the old cafe that they used to have on Fridays, the Neuro Talks.
Oh, learning salon or something?
Yeah, learning salon. Yeah. So he did a learning salon. It was really interesting. So this is it's a new Nature paper. Language is primarily a tool for communication rather than thought. So the abstract of this, of course, is language is a defining characteristic of our species, but the function or functions that it serves has been debated for centuries. So this is where, of course, in large language models, I think there's this aspect of language being a tool for thought. Like, whatever the large language model is thinking is what's generated in terms of language or linguistic content. And what they're saying here is it's actually communication. So, language is useless without communication. You have to communicate to other humans, or it could be agents or whatever, to get any meaning out of language. So here we bring recent evidence from neuroscience and applied disciplines to argue that in modern humans, language is a tool for communication, contrary to a prominent view that we use language for thinking. So this aspect of language as communication is key really to the whole aspect of like context, but also creativity, because if something is creative, it has to be creative in a context. We begin by introducing the brain network that supports linguistic ability in humans. We then review evidence for a double dissociation between language and thought. So you knock out the thought aspect and you just have the language. And then, you can do that same thing with thought. You can have thought without language. Although it's hard to really express thought without language, which is kind of the problem. They're kind of disentangled, or they're kind of entangled in a way that is, it sort of implies that one necessitates the other, but maybe, it's really about communication more than thought. And then discuss several properties of language that suggest that it's optimized for communication. So it's not that language is not involved in thought, it's that it's optimized for communication rather than thought. And of course, if we think about something, we can describe things in different amounts of detail. It's really about, thinking is, kind of, I guess you can think in you could think in purely mathematical terms, and that would be different from thinking in sort of descriptive terms. And those are different kinds of expressions. So, but to optimize those, you have to have communication. You have to go back to the literature or talk to someone about it. And you can then kind of, narrow your representation or refine your representation. We conclude that although the emergence of language has unquestionably transformed human culture, language does not appear to be a prerequisite for complex thought, including symbolic thought. So we don't need to have language to have complex or symbolic thoughts. We can represent our thoughts in pure mathematics, which I guess is a language, but it's not, you don't need to have a natural language like English to do it. But of course, I don't know if we could really reasonably do, only communicate in, something that isn't a natural language. Instead, language is a powerful tool for the transmission of cultural knowledge. So this is where, where you get into cultural evolution and transmitting ideas to, and then of course in cultural evolution you have a lot of recombination processes. So it's not just creativity, but it's like if you communicate cultural knowledge, sometimes that cultural knowledge mutates, sometimes it recombines, and there are different rules for that. And if you look in the cultural evolution literature, they've tried to model this process. And so this is tied to, the evolution of culture and the evolution of language. It plausibly co-evolved with their thinking and reasoning capacities and only reflects rather than gives rise to the signature sophistication of human cognition. So that's that paper. And yeah, again, I think they make really good points there, especially with respect to how, language is kind of tied to cultural evolution. And we can actually look at creativity as an artifact of cultural evolution, because what we're doing is we're basically evolving culture when we're creating. So
Yeah, I think that's actually a much better way to think about it, because that it's implicitly referencing all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So to sort of treat it like it's this abstract quality is a bit like the brain in the vat stuff. It's just this mind that calculates things. It's just the creativity of, it's like so if that's what felt so wrong earlier. It's like, oh, creativity as this thing that just exists abstracted away from any context and is very creative, and it's like no, it's like it's not disconnected. So
right.
Yeah. And that's a little bit of, well, yeah, I had one other comment that's I'll say after the paper discussion.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's it. I mean, for today. But if you want to say what you want to say,
it was the last thing, just for myself, or for to put in here. If I'll go back and look at this, I put it in chat. It said, I'm trying to interpret what I said again. Broader context of acceptability to explore, play, and safely experience things. I think this was sort of I was thinking about it when Morgan was getting into the bit about like you don't when you give someone a violin, they just don't start playing. You have to kind of initiate them through it. You do that sort of thing, but also what again culturally and all this other broader stuff in the sense of I think there's something to one of the things that I don't think we're talking about enough right now, and this goes all the way back to my commentary on what would a present-day Norbert Wiener say about a lot of things in terms of his sense of how computation or cybernetics would afford nuances of experience. What we don't talk about now, and what I'm very, very extremely interested in is to the extent that it's a driving factor in a lot of things, kind of person studies related, kind of broader aims, even mental health working group and other things, is there's an extreme difference in, not everywhere, but in the world as at least from what I can tell, because I haven't lived in times before this, but the arena in which to express, like there are factors that have constrained why languages of expression of experience have not happened before. And some of it is simply because there wasn't any means by which to comparatively communicate, like, yes, internet, but also like the means by which there was a common enough frame of reference or viewpoint or technology to assist it. And sort of the vantage point, essay that I talked about before, there wasn't even there wasn't enough like preliminary scaffolding at a broad level to do it. And so I have this, I don't really know what to call it, but there's a specific graph in my mind that I have been working on for several months that touches upon what I'm saying. And I'm basically just saying this here as like, there are very specific differences. Like there are reasons certain things haven't had the means by which to be developed, relative to the ease of interacting with other, like there's a reason why in the context of that article, there's a reason why we put someone on the moon and we put spaceships in space, because of, take away any normative stuff, take away any like hard science, soft science, whatever, the means by which to have a number of people associatively like sharing a context or how to work on a problem is very different. And there are things that have influenced that over time, like civilizationally, we're in a very different vantage point now than we ever have been before.
Yeah.
And as such, it allows there's new to center back on like the expressions thing. There's new things in that space that have always existed, but haven't really had the means by which to have popularity and potentially built off that way. So this is mostly, I'm saying this kind of to myself.
Right.
When I look back to the video, I know it's really vague, but I really enjoy this discussion. I'm going to go back to this discussion we've had for this paper a lot. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, that's good. Good stuff. All right. So yeah, thanks for attending and that great conversation. And let's follow up on this conversation in particular. I think this was really good.
Yeah. I just point out that
Piandowski or whatever. Yeah.
His that Chomsky paper that he did is still on the leaderboard at LingBuzz.
Yeah.
Which is like the linguistics.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's still reverberating.
Oh, it's good. Yeah.
I think there's some really interesting things there in terms of just the discussions that have been ongoing in linguistics itself about the role of language and its development that I think would be really interesting.
Maybe I'll try to get that paper up for next time.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks. Have a good week.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.